Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History of Russia Part 5 by Epic History TV. If you guys haven't already, please check out channel memberships. You can get exclusive reaction content. It is that join button right next to the subscribe button. Anyway, back to the reaction. So, in last time's video on Russian history, we witnessed at the beginning the Decembrist uprising and the rise of Nicholas I. Then we went through many important events in Russian history, such as the embarrassing loss during the Crimean War, the freedom of the serfs, though it wasn't in perfect freedom, they still had to pay back a lot of debt, and the assassination of the great reformer Alexander II. And that is where we are beginning this one. I'm excited to get into it. Once again, please check out those channel memberships. Let's jump right into this reaction. Alright, part 5. Last part before the revolution.
In 1881, Russian Emperor Alexander II was assassinated by left-wing terrorists in St. Petersburg.
Yeah. Assassinated by anarchists, and of course the irony is that he was perhaps the most progressive czar Russia had ever had. And by assassinating him, the leftist revolutionaries brought themselves to a far worse fate, his successor.
Today, the place where he was fatally wounded is marked by the magnificent Church of the Saviour on Spilled Blood. Alexander II had been a reformer, hailed as the liberator for freeing Russia's serfs. But his son and successor, Alexander III, believed his father's reforms had unleashed dangerous forces within Russia.
Yeah, and I mean, to some extent he might have been right, but also trying to crush those dangerous forces sometimes just makes them even angrier. Alex II, he was definitely a reformer. Now, he was an authoritarian czar, right? So you gotta keep that in mind. He was no liberal figure. But, you know, his reforms were real. Some of them were imperfect. A lot of his reforms were more gradual than they could have been. Freeing the serfs, like I mentioned, was imperfect, but I do think his reforms were important and they were meaningful. I mean, setting up the Zemstvas, this is sort of the first real sort of local government that the Russian people have had. So there is some really important stuff there, and his successor is going to be far more conservative.
That ultimately led to his death. As emperor, he publicly vowed to reassert autocratic rule,
Yep.
declaring that, in the midst of our great grief, the voice of God orders us to undertake courageously the task of ruling, with faith in the strength and rightness of autocratic power. The Tsar.
Back to tradition. You know, we don't want none of this Western liberal reforming stuff. Alex III is going back to, you know, the traditional Russian tsardom, autocracy, the things that make Russia Russia in the eyes of someone like him.
Tsar's secret police, the so-called Okhranka, was ordered to infiltrate Russia's many revolutionary groups. Those found guilty of plotting against the government were hanged.
Yeah, the secret police became very active in this period. And there were a lot of political executions and a lot of political dissidents who were exiled to Siberia. This really ramped up during this time period. Though to be fair, I think if we're talking late 1800s into early 1900s, sort of leftist revolutionary activity also ramped up around the globe. I mean, you've got a lot of socialist, communist, anarchist revolutionaries. I mean, this is leading up to a couple of important wars and revolutions. So the oppression ramped up, but so did the revolutionary activity.
Or sent into internal exile in Siberia.
Yep.
Alexander III was a pious man who supported the Orthodox Church and the assertion of a strong Russian national identity. Russia's Jews became victims of this policy. They'd already been targeted in murderous race riots known as pogroms after false rumors were spread that they were responsible for the assassination of the emperor.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this before. I mean, the Jews have always had a really hard time. They've always been a persecuted people, but this is when it starts to get really bad for them in Europe. There's a wave of pogroms, which are violent attacks on Jewish communities in this area, which, if you'll remember, is the Pale of Settlement. This is the only area of the Russian Empire that Jews were allowed to live in. And attacks on Jews intensify, particularly in the Russian Empire. Also outside the Russian Empire, anti-Semitism intensifies across Europe. Countries like France are extraordinarily anti-Semitic. Funnily enough, Germany actually isn't one of the most anti-Semitic countries. There's some quotes about if you'd ask someone before World War II which country would try to genocide their Jews, people of the time probably would have said France or Russia, who seemed a lot more anti-Semitic. Of course, the Holocaust ended up being in Nazi Germany, and that was the worst atrocity of this period. But even before then, Jews were getting abused, murdered, attacked in the streets.
Now, the government expelled 20,000 Jews from Moscow, and many who could began to leave the country.
Yep, and this is the start of a massive exodus of people from Eastern Europe and Russia. And where did a lot of them go? To the United States. So late 1800s, early 1900s, the United States, particularly cities like New York in the East Coast, are getting a lot of Eastern European and Russian immigrants, many of them who are Jews. They mentioned that the Russian government kicked some Jews out of Moscow. These pogroms, these attacks on Jewish communities, they often happened either with sort of authorities turning the other way, just ignoring them, or with the explicit approval of local police. So, the Jews really had no friend in this circumstance, and this is why a lot of them fled the country. A lot of them came to America, where there absolutely was still anti-Semitism, but it was at least better than Russia.
Over the next 40 years, around 2 million Jews would leave Russia, most bound for the USA.
Yep.
Concerned by the growing
and obviously, a lot of the East Coast, particularly New York, is sort of famous for having strong Jewish populations, and this is part of the reason why.
Power of Germany, Russia signed an alliance with France. Both.
Yeah, and, I was talking about World War II earlier, but now we start seeing the build-up to World War I.
Sides promising military aid if the other was attacked. Sergei Witte was appointed Russia's new Minister of Finance. His reforms helped to modernize the Russian economy and encourage foreign investment, particularly from its new ally, France.
Yeah, there are a couple of important figures in this period who basically serve as prime ministers. I mean, the Tsar is supposed to have absolute power, but figures like Witte, like I said, sort of, he wasn't the prime minister, but he sort of basically served as that position. He was kind of running the country, or he had the main authority in that respect, and he was a reformer, but these guys are not liberals. Keep that in mind. They're still okay with the repression, the executions, the secret police. They just want to reform and bring more investment into the country.
French loans helped Russia to develop its industry and infrastructure. Work began on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Completed in 1916, it remains the world's longest railway line.
Yeah, it seems like during this period, every country wanted a railroad that went across the entire country. Of course, we had in America following the Civil War. It took Russia a couple more decades, but they finally got their railroad that stretches across their country.
Running 5,772 miles.
Wow.
From Moscow to Vladivostok.
That's pretty impressive.
Alexander III was succeeded by his son, Nicholas II.
Oh, Nicholas.
His coronation was marred by tragedy when 1,400 people were crushed to death at an open-air celebration in Moscow.
Yep. And Nicholas is an interesting figure. He's definitely not as conservative as his dad, as Alexander III. Alexander III is basically an arch-conservative. Nicholas isn't like that, but he still does believe in autocracy, orthodoxy, nationality. He's a believer. in the Russian autocracy. So he's conservative in that way, but he's far less conservative. He's more kind of wishy-washy. He's a little more moderate. He's not really a decisive man, to be honest. He's easily influenceable. All the qualities of a monarch who fares badly during a revolution. We've seen a couple of them, and that's exactly how Nicholas is.
China granted Russia the right to build a naval base at Port Arthur. When China faced a major revolt, known as the Boxer Rebellion, Russia moved troops into Manchuria under the pretext of defending Port Arthur from the rebels.
Right.
This brought Russia into
And by the way, all the European countries were doing this. The Boxer Rebellion led to this remarkable coalition of world powers, Western powers, who all came together to supposedly put down the rebellion, and they were doing that. But they were putting down the rebellion in order to, 1, protect their territory, protect their imperial gains, and 2, seize even more territory from China. And Russia did the same. But this would end up being bad for Russia, not because of anything China did, but because who they're about to get into a conflict with.
Conflict with Japan, who also had designs over Manchuria and Korea.
And Japan had felt kind of left out up until this point. Japan was trying to be a modern imperial power, and by all metrics, they were succeeding. But the Western powers, the European powers, and the United States continually tried to keep Japan out of their imperial deals. They didn't want this small Asian nation in on their business, so Japan, it's got a chip on its shoulder at this point.
Japanese made a surprise attack on Port Arthur, then defeated the Russian army at the giant Battle of Mukden.
Yep.
Russia's Baltic fleet, meanwhile, had sailed halfway around the world to reach the Pacific, where it was immediately annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima.
Man, this is extremely humiliating for the Russians. This is a nation that the Europeans had thought as lesser. Japan, they didn't want to include Japan in all their imperial discussions, and they thought they were racially inferior. Racism's big at this point. We've got scientific racism. The Europeans and the Americans feel that, Japan might be trying to be sort of this reformed imperial power, but they can't truly do it because they're not white. And in this instance, Japan showed them to be extremely wrong. Japan humiliated Russia and really shocked the Western world that this small non-white nation could fight back against this massive European power. It was actually an inspiring event for a lot of Asian and non-white people around the globe. It just so happens that Japan would become an imperial power and would be equally as brutal as the European powers. So any support for the Japanese would fade as Japan began to colonize the rest of Asia. But at this point, there were a lot of non-white people who kind of felt inspired by this show of force against the European powers. I mean, Russia in particular, but it was more symbolic.
Russia was left with no option but to sign a humiliating peace.
I mean, not China. China wasn't feeling inspired, to be clear. China was feeling like it was being dominated by everybody.
Brokered by US President Theodore Roosevelt.
Teddy.
Meanwhile, the Tsar faced another crisis much closer to home.
Yep. And just as with the Crimean War, military failure can often lead to crisis at home. Now, with the Crimean War, it didn't lead to any sort of revolution. It just led to humiliation and the feeling that Russia was really outdated. This military victory, which is far more humiliating than the Crimean War, is going to lead to problems domestically.
In St. Petersburg, a strike by steel workers had escalated, and plans were made for a mass demonstration. Tens of thousands of protesters marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar, asking for better workers' rights and more political freedom. But instead, troops opened fire on the crowds, killing more than 100.
Uh-oh.
Bloody Sunday, as it became known, led to more strikes and unrest across the country. The crew of the battleship Potemkin mutinied, killing their officers and taking control of the ship.
Yep.
To defuse the crisis, Nicholas II reluctantly issued the October Manifesto.
Nicholas's first revolution, by the way. Unfortunate guy, he had to deal with two of them. Well, I mean, the 1917 revolution was actually a couple of them, but basically two revolutions, and Nicholas had to issue the October Manifesto, which, to be clear, was kind of too little too late. I mean, he was offering some liberal reforms that people had requested a while ago.
Drafted under the supervision of Sergei Witte. It promised an elected assembly and new political rights, including freedom of speech, and was welcomed by most moderates. Russia's first constitution was drafted the next year. For the first time, the Tsar would share power with an elected assembly, the State Duma, though the Tsar had the right to veto it.
Okay, I guess we're done with the 1905 revolution. So my take is that, the Tsar offered these liberal concessions. And it did satisfy moderates, sure, but a lot of people were not satisfied. The 1905 revolution ended up failing, though. Why did it fail? I think it really comes down to this trend that we saw beginning. Well, I mean, you could say it begins with the French Revolution, but it really kicks into motion with the 1848 revolutions. What happened then? Well, there was these big revolutions, but there was a couple of different factions. Sort of the main factions amongst the revolutionaries were sort of these middle-class liberals and lower-class kind of socialists. They weren't socialists at that point, but at this point, that's what they're developing, right? And so we have this split between the middle class and the working class. They don't want the same things. And this is what we see in 1905. The working class and these middle class liberals, they cannot unite. And so what the Tsar does is that basically he offers these liberal concessions, which kind of satisfies the liberal middle and upper classes, and then he absolutely decimates the working class protesters and revolutionaries. And of course, we're going to see this split in 1917 between, the sort of middle class liberal faction and the working class socialist and communist faction. Except the difference will be that, of course, in the end, the communists will win. So, the Tsar does offer some concessions, but he still retains most of his power, and as we'll see, he kind of goes back on a lot of these concessions.
Its legislation, and dissolve it at any time. Sergei Witte finally...
Right, so how much power is he really giving up? He can veto anything he wants, and he can dissolve the parliament whenever he wants. So he's definitely giving up some power, but this really wasn't satisfying to even more radical liberals. Really only moderates and some more conservative liberals were satisfied.
Finally lost the Tsar's confidence and was dismissed. The Tsar's new Prime Minister, Stolypin, introduced land reform.
This is the next guy who will be very important after Witte.
To help the peasants, while dealing severely with Russia's would-be revolutionaries. So much so that the hangman's noose got a new nickname.
Here we go.
Stolypin's necktie.
Yeah, everyone loves that little tidbit. So Stolypin, like Witte, another example of a guy who wants to reform and wants to modernize, but he's not a liberal. Do not get that idea. Or at least he's not a radical. He is completely fine with oppression and repression. He will execute these revolutionaries and these radicals. So it's kind of an interesting thing, right? He wants to reform, he wants to modernize, but he wants to do it through the power of the Tsar. He will keep that autocratic way of doing things.
But having survived several attempts on his life, Stolypin was shot and killed by an assassin at the Kiev Opera House.
Another assassination. We will see that the period from the late 1800s into the early mid-1900s, there is an exceptionally high number of political assassinations. We see another trend of political assassinations again in the 1960s. MLK, JFK, Robert Kennedy, we see a lot of political assassinations then as well. But, in this time period, there's a ton a lot of them from leftist radicals or anarchist revolutionaries. The anarchists are very much feared amongst the liberal societies of the West at this point. They are sort of the main terrorists of this era.
Meanwhile, Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian faith healer, had joined the imperial family's inner circle, thanks to his unique ability to ease the suffering of the Tsar's hemophiliac son.
Yeah, that's a concerning photo.
Alexei. Despite sporadic...
Yeah, there's some debate over how he did this. Some argue that it was about not giving Alexei aspirin. Some argue that it was basically a soothing presence. Rasputin was very close to the Tsarina, the mother of young hemophiliac Alexei. And, stress and that kind of stuff can make the bleeding worse, can make him more ill. And so some said that it was just Rasputin's calming presence that made the boy feel better. But, of course, there's a lot of debate over this. We truly don't know what the cause was and how Rasputin did this. Could have been coincidence. But I feel like, a lot of people do sort of agree that part of it was definitely that he just calmed Alexei's mother down, and that in general helped.
Sporadic acts of terrorism, Russia now had the fastest growing economy in Europe. Agricultural and industrial output were on the rise. Most ordinary Russians remained loyal to the Tsar and his family. Russia's future seemed bright.
I guess. I mean, it was industrializing, but keep in mind that Russian society at this point, and Russian society when the revolution happens in 1917, is still extremely rural, extremely agricultural. Most people are still peasants, right? And that's why it's so interesting that, Russia was the first country to have a successful communist revolution, because it really wasn't that industrialized, The majority of the population was not working class proletariat. The majority of the population were still peasants.
In 1914, in Sarajevo, a Slav nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, sparking a European crisis. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Emperor Nicholas ordered the Russian army to mobilize, to show his support for a fellow Slav nation. Austria-Hungary's ally, Germany, saw Russian mobilization as a threat and declared war. Europe's network of alliances came into effect.
Yeah, and there's a very famous series of telegraphs between Nicholas and the German Kaiser, because they were cousins, All the monarchs of Europe at this point were basically related. All kids are grandkids of Queen Victoria. It's a whole, network of inbreeding, so they're all cousins, basically. So the Kaiser and Nicholas had this series of telegraphs where they're basically both trying to sort of avert war, but also inching closer and closer. And they're using familial names and being very friendly. But, of course, in the end, they end up going to war, and it's not going to end well for either of them. So, that's why, these communications are so famous.
And soon, all the major powers were marching to war. World War I had begun. Russia experienced a wave of patriotic fervor. The capital, St. Petersburg, was even renamed Petrograd, to sound less German.
Yep, same thing with the war with Japan. Initially, there was a wave of support, of patriotism, and that ended very badly for Russia, and in particular for Nicholas. We're going to see the same thing here, basically.
An early Russian advance into East Prussia ended with heavy defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. There was greater success against Austria-Hungary, but that too came at a high price.
Yeah, Austria-Hungary was kind of a second-rate power at this point. They were really being carried by Germany, and similarly to World War II, Germany, just on its own, was extremely powerful, right? It had allies, but those allies were useful in certain ways, but Germany was absolutely, far more powerful than someone like Austria-Hungary. And so that's what the Russians really had trouble with.
Russian losses forced the army to make a general retreat in 1915. In 1916, Russia's Brusilov offensive against Austro-Hungarian forces was one of the most successful Allied attacks of the war. But losses were so heavy that the Russian army was unable to launch any more major operations. In Petrograd, Rasputin, whose alleged influence over the Tsar's family was despised by certain Russian aristocrats, was murdered, possibly with the help of British agents.
I don't know about that, but there's a very famous story about Rasputin dying and being poisoned, and he survived it, and basically, just this crazy story that you can look up if you want to hear it. But the thing about Rasputin, he was despised at the time. It was sort of thought that there was this belief, and this had been a belief for a while, that if your monarch was doing bad things or performing badly, that it wasn't the fault of the monarch, it was the fault of conniving, scheming ministers. And Rasputin filled that role. People thought, well, if we could just get Rasputin gone, then, Nicholas would be doing a lot better. The war would be going better. This is all the fault of Rasputin. And so he was executed. Well, he was assassinated. But, as we know, in the end, Rasputin, while he certainly had influence over the royal family, he didn't have that much influence. It wasn't due to him that the war was going badly. It wasn't due to him that everything would end badly for the Russian family. That is primarily the fault of massive geopolitical events and Nicholas himself. Here we go.
The war put intolerable strain.
I guess we're going to briefly cover it in this video, but they have a separate video on the revolution, which I will react to.
On Russia. At the front, losses were enormous, while in the cities, economic mismanagement led to rising prices and food shortages.
Uh-oh. Man, let me think about some other revolutions. The French Revolution in 1848, what did they have in common? Famines, food shortages, people starving. It seems to be a bad sign.
In Petrograd, the workers' frustration led to strikes and demonstrations. Troops ordered to disperse the crowds refused and joined the protesters instead.
Uh-oh. Yeah, Witte and Stolypin wanted to modernize Russia, and that's great. But while doing that, you created a working-class proletariat that is going to be a big part of why your government is now being overthrown.
The government had lost control of the capital. On board the imperial train at Puskov, senior politicians and generals told the emperor he must abdicate, or Russia would descend into anarchy.
He wasn't happy about this. Nicholas was not happy at all. But, like I said, he was not a decisive arch-conservative like Alexander III. He was he was conservative, but he was a more indecisive, moderate kind of guy. So, he didn't like it, but he did abdicate.
And lose the war. Nicholas accepted their advice and renounced the throne in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who effectively declined the offer.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, who wouldn't? If you're Michael, are you going to accept the job? The country's falling apart. You basically have a revolution going on. The war is not going well. You've got people are starving in the streets. If I was Michael, I would also be like, yeah, no, I'm not the guy for the job. Sorry.
400 years of Romanov rule were at an end.
What a remarkable
Russia
dynasty.
was now a republic. A provisional government took power, but could not halt Russia's slide into economic and military chaos.
Right, well, the issue was that the people of Russia wanted food. They wanted the economic chaos to stop, and they wanted an end to the war. But the provisional government gets into power, and they really can't find a good way to pull out of the war. Now, in retrospect, it probably would have been better for them if they just pulled out of the war. They might have been able to keep their government. But in their position, they just felt like they couldn't. They felt like, they'd made promises to their allies, or Nicholas had made promises to their allies, and they were going to keep them. In the end, this led to the destruction of their government, but that's what they chose to do.
Workers, soldiers, and peasants elected their own councils, known as Soviets.
Yup. That's where the term Soviet comes from. It's just a workers' council. And of course, we know what this is going to become.
The Petrograd Soviet was so powerful, it was effectively a rival government.
Yeah, we basically have a dual power situation. And this dual power situation will sort of continue with in the USSR and other communist countries like China, where you have sort of the government and the government bureaucracy, and then the party and the party bureaucracy. But at this point, it's a different situation of dual power. They have the liberal provisional government, which certainly had a lot of radicals and socialists in it, but it's the liberal provisional government, and then the communist Petrograd Soviet, and yet they are basically competing governments.
Especially as discontent with the provisional government continued to grow.
Yep.
The Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin.
And Lenin, by the way, had been sent back to Russia by the Germans. Well, I don't know if you'd say it was a good move or a bad move on their part. I'm sure they never could have imagined what this would lead to, but it did effectively disrupt Russia further, which is what they wanted. So they sent Lenin back. They wanted to disrupt Russia, and I mean, that is very much what Lenin is going to do.
Attracted growing support with their radical proposals for an immediate end to the war, the redistribution of land, and transfer of power to the Soviets.
Yep, and this is what people wanted. Land, peace, bread. That was a slogan, or peace, bread, and land. I forget which order it was in. That was a slogan, and it was very effective because that's what the people wanted. The peasants wanted land. They're tired of being basically sharecroppers on other people's lands. Serfdom was ended decades ago, but in some ways, the peasants, their lives haven't improved that much. They've definitely improved, definitely. Don't get me wrong. But they're still not doing super great. The people, particularly the people in the cities, they want food, bread. They can't afford to buy food. They're starving. And more than anything, they want peace. Because they feel like the war is contributing to all these problems. And like I said, the provisional government just felt it wasn't realistic to do these things. So now the Bolsheviks are seizing on these things that the provisional government has failed and that the people want. And they're saying, fine, we'll do them.
In October, they launched a coup, masterminded by Leon Trotsky.
And to be clear, the Bolsheviks were not the most popular faction at this point. There were the Social Democrats and the Mensheviks, but you don't need to be the most popular faction in order to do a successful revolution. You certainly need a lot of people. You need dedicated people. You need soldiers willing to fight for you, and you need the momentum. And all of these things the Bolsheviks had. They also had, say, the brilliant military mind of someone like Leon Trotsky, and the brilliant political mind of someone like Lenin.
Bolshevik Red Guards stormed the Winter Palace, where the provisional government met, and arrested its members. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in charge.
Yep.
Russia had been thrown upon a bold and dangerous course. Under a Marxist-inspired revolutionary party, it would now seek to create the world's first communist state. But first, it would have to survive the chaos and slaughter of one of history's bloodiest civil wars.
Yes, it would. All right, wow. That was great. I'm looking at their playlist right now. What we have left is a video on the Russian Revolution. In fact, there's two videos, but I think one is just the updated version of the other. So I will react to that. I'm not sure if they have other Russian history videos. It seems like the series ended there, but of course, there's a lot of Russian history to go. I mean, we've got the Civil War, That's incredibly crazy. We've got the whole Soviet Union, Stalin, World War II. I mean, there's a lot of interesting history there on its own. But in this series, we've got the Russian Revolution, and then I think we're probably going to end it there. If you guys have other recommendations for videos on Russian history, modern Russian history, that'd certainly be interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe, leave a like, and please become a channel member. The join button is right next to the subscribe button, and you will get exclusive reaction content on a consistent basis. Anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.